We have the pleasure of welcoming Jon Ingham today to our interview series Leaders Hum. I'm Aishwarya Jain from the peopleHum team. Before we begin, just a quick intro of peopleHum. peopleHum is an end-to-end, one-view integrated human capital management automation platform, the winner of the 2019 Global Cody Award for HCM that is specifically built for crafted employee experiences and the future of work with AI and automation technologies. We run the peopleHum blog and video channel, which receives upwards of 200,000 visitors a year and publish around 2 interviews with well-known names globally every month. And now for our guest, Jon Ingham is a well-known human resources consultant who works with companies around the globe on organizational and people-centric design. He is also a leadership coach helping leaders globally to thrive and achieve their goals. He has been listed as among one of the most influential HR leaders by HR Executive and HR Magazine. Jon is also the author of the book The Social Organization. With a vast experience right from the start of his career, we're very, very happy to have someone of his expertise talk to us about people and people-centric organizations. Welcome, Jon. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful for having me, and forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Our pleasure, Jon. So, Jon, tell us a little about your journey that brought you to this place as a people strategist. What was your inspiration to move forward in this journey?
Well, I suppose I should perhaps just explain the people strategist term as well, because I know it's not that common a one. So I work as a consultant, trainer, speaker, writer, analyst, various other things. But I work across the full employee life cycle. I do a lot of work around organisation effectiveness as well. So the one sort of common focus, everything I do, is a concern to help HR be more strategic and have a bigger impact contribution to the businesses that we're in. And my the impetus for that, I suppose, was so I started my career working in sort of outside HR. So I worked in IT, which is part of the reason I'm still so interested in people technologies today. And then got a job from working in change management as an HR director. So I was working with Ernst & Young in the UK, doing a lot of strategic work there. And then I moved, I took a secondment to Moscow as the HR director for the former Soviet Union, in a very, very operational based role. And I was sort of missing the strategic aspect that I'd had in the UK. And one of my trips back here was to the CIPD, the HR Institute conference in the UK, and saw one of the key professors of HR in the UK, Linda Grattan. Now, this was quite some time ago, and Linda's key book at that point was called Living Strategy. And it was all about exploring how HR can be strategic through what we do with people, having a long-term focus to what we achieve. And particularly as I was in that role at the time, I got very excited about the opportunity to be more strategic in HR. And came back to the UK, was led an HR consulting group here, and we did lots of great strategic HR work, published some of that in a book around that was called Strategic Human Capital Management, went independent and have been working independently for the last sort of 15 years, and really, really focusing on that issue. How do we connect HR and competitive advantage, not so that we're just sort of doing the same HR processes as everybody else, but doing them better, but really focusing on what's going to make the difference to the strategic success of the organisation by what we're doing in the people and organisation space. So that's sort of how I see it and why I do what I do.
That's wonderful, Jon. You know, it's such a great area. You're working with people, and there's so many mindsets that you work with, and HR is not a very simple process. It's getting more and more complicated, and there are so many things involved in it, right? So what are your learnings from creating a social organization, and you've kind of if you could also elaborate on what exactly is the social organization?
Sure. So my first book, at the beginning of my independent career, focused on strategic human capital management. So managing people in a way that would accumulate human capital as a resource to drive their businesses forward. And in that book, I described what human capital is. I talked about this other thing, social capital, as well. But back then, I didn't really understand what social capital was. Other than so particularly in my strategic HR role at EY, so I was head of HR for the audit discipline, and we put people out in audit teams, going out to clients, doing work together. And one of the things that was very obvious to me coming into HR was that the performance in that department came through the way that people work together in teams. So one of the really stupid questions I asked early on in my HR career, while you still have that capacity to ask stupid questions, was, why, if the point of performance is the team, why does everything that you do in this profession on HR focus on individuals? And again, that's been another sort of key question behind a lot of my work and thinking in this space. And therefore, although I believe strongly that human capital is important, I have this thought in the background that if the teams are more important than individuals, social capital is more important than human capital. But I didn't really understand what social capital was. So I've been exploring that for the last sort of 20 years, really. And I almost wrote The Social Organisation back in around sort of 2005, particularly as social media started to become much more important. And I thought, yes, there's clearly a connection there, that as we start more and more through these social tools, that's going to become, and that's going to make social capital become more important, which it absolutely did. I just didn't quite get around to writing the book. And then over the last sort of 5 years, I think there's been a lot more around sort of modern organisation design and this idea of sort of moving from hierarchies to networks, which I don't think is the sort of full essence of what's happening, really, although is certainly part of the shift. And I think that this new focus on how do we organise our businesses to bring people together as effectively as possible, that again is making social capital more important. So finally, about 3 years ago, I managed to find the space in my calendar to pull all of these ideas together and write the book, The Social Organisation. And what it is very much the same sort of approach that I took in strategic human capital management, but now looking at, if social capital is the main driver of strategic success in organizations today, then how do we do HR? How do we do organization design in a way that leads to that capability? How do we manage, measure, develop, reward the performance of teams and other groups and networks, rather than simply doing that for individuals? And I think it's you're absolutely right. I agree. HR is not simple. And particularly when we transfer our focus to collective groups, HR becomes even more complex. So it's not easy, but I think it's more and more the key way in today's world that we can ensure that HR is strategically connected with driving our businesses forward.
Absolutely. And it's very interesting how you talk about, the social aspect of this, social capital more than human capital. And because there's so much, there's so many jargons out there. There's human capital, and then there's, people first, and there's so much confusion around this, right? Yeah. So, what is your opinion about that term, human capital? And, we have had different opinions on the same, but is it time to really stop that terminology?
So yes, because the terminology doesn't work for people. And yeah, although my first book was Strategic Human Capital Management, I've sort of given up that battle. And so I tend, certainly when I'm talking to groups of employees, I don't talk about it. I simply talk about the qualities, the value that we're growing in our people. But I agree with you. I think HR is complicated and particularly complex. It's not just about doing simple things well. We do need to be smart about how we do things, and particularly when we focus on strategic HR, we have to get to grips with how we're connecting people and the business better. And I think that requires terminology and ideas and concepts and clarity about what we're trying to articulate. And I think we can be a little bit unclear. So, a lot of the things I read these days about employee experience, for example, I think is a key area where people talk far too loosely about what we mean. Whereas really, if we want to be able to deal and create whatever it is, whether it's experience or engagement or diversity or collaboration, if we don't really understand what we're talking about, it's going to be much more difficult to get there. And I think human capital is an absolutely key concept and attribute and factor that we need to understand. We need to get much better at connecting all of the processes, the activities, the organisation interventions that we undertake, not just with the business objectives we're trying to support and enable, but doing that through the qualities that we're connecting in our people. So if we connect, if we think about what processes do we need to undertake to give us particular outcomes in our people and organisation, so things like human and social capital, and use those to connect with the business objectives, it makes our whole approach, our whole attempt at aligning with the business much more effective and solid and focused. It helps make us more strategic, and it opens the door to a much more effective way of operating. So I won't talk about human capital or even social capital if I'm doing a presentation to the workforce or something. But it's absolutely vital that HR gets a handle on what this key piece of terminology means. Because when we're talking about it in HR, it's not jargon, it's terminology, and we need the terminology. And I think we suffer if we can't talk about what we're trying to create. I did a consulting project some time back with a client that wouldn't let people use the word engagement because it felt engagement was too soft and fluffy, which is fine. I always try to respond to the clients I'm working in. But I think at some point, if you can't talk about what you're trying to create, it's certainly not going to make things any easier, and probably at some point is going to constrain your effectiveness. We did improve engagement, but the fact that we couldn't talk about the word, made it harder to do that. And the same thing in strategic HR. If we can't talk about human and social capital because they sound a bit jargonistic, even though they're not, then we're going to find being strategic that much harder. So I would encourage HR practitioners to really understand this key concept. It's important. We need to understand what it is and therefore how we can create it.
Absolutely. I think there is a lack of awareness in HR, and HR professionals, they don't understand terminologies. They're just trying to do something, but they're not really getting anywhere. And HR, a very important aspect is for them to get the culture of the organization right, to create teams that are winning, to encourage positivity. So what are your learnings from your so much of experience that you have? What are your learnings? What is it that HR should really focus on when it comes to getting people together and maintaining a good culture in organizations?
Right. Well, first of all, I try not to talk about culture. because I actually think that's one of those weaker terms that just takes us an unhelpful path. Because either we don't understand what we mean by culture, or even if we do, if we have clarity in terms of what we mean by it, because culture as a term is so overused and abused and misused, it's just very it's very common that when we're talking to somebody about culture, they have a very different perspective of what we mean than the one that we have. So I firstly try to get people to be a lot clearer. What is it that we're trying to shift? Is it people's attitudes or their values or the behaviours or the way people are connected? And very often, actually, if there was one thing that I think people really are talking about, it's social capital. How do they build the quality, the value of the way people are connecting and relating, and the quality of the conversations that they're having? So my own preference is to talk about that. And actually, so in the book, in The Social Organisation, which is really all about culture change, I don't mention the word culture at all, other than to explain why I'm not going to talk about it. So the first thing is, what are we trying to change? Again, what are the outcomes that we're trying to create in our people and organisation? And if it is sort of something about the social fabric of the organisation, is trying to articulate that as clearly as we can. Because once we've got that clarity, we're in a much better position then to work out what the shifts need to be. But then in terms of the sort of response, so some of the examples of things that I think organisations can do, I do think organisation design is a big one. And in fact, so when I started writing the book, so 20 years ago, again, as I was saying before, I had this focus around social technology, and increasingly I became, and that's still a big part of it, and particularly, while the coronavirus pandemic is on, and we've got so many people now suddenly working remotely, using the digital workplace to communicate with the organisation, the social technologies that we're using have suddenly become the organisation design. So the technology is a big piece, but it should never be the key focus. We should always try to work out what we're trying to do and then use technology to support that, rather than just sort of launch the technology because it sounds sort of wonderful, and some vendors and I know you don't do this, but people do grab hold of technology, and we do need to invest in technology, but we should always do that in a way to achieve something else. So the first thing is the organisation design, and it is partly about moving away from or building on hierarchies with other ways of organising. So teams, communities, networks, ecosystems, platforms, looking at all of those different ways of organising. And I think that's so key, because if we have, if the way we're organised formally disagrees, counters the way we actually need to be organised, then that causes lots of conflict and frustration with inside an organisation. So things like organisation development interventions, which we can also use to improve the outcomes we're trying to create in the organisation. If the organisation design is wrong, is inappropriate, it's very difficult to use organisation development interventions effectively, because the tension between people's roles and the way they're organised will always get in the way. So you start with the organisation design, and then you build HR processes to make that work. So again, things like performance management and reward, how do we shift their focus to the team rather than simply individuals? So things like individual bonuses, for example. Firstly, if you look at lots of the research around reward, probably don't work anyway. They can negatively impact people's performance easily as much as they do enable it, but particularly when you're looking at the collaborative environment, they ruin collaboration. So we may need to have a look at team level bonuses, but the simplest thing very often is simply to remove the individual ones, to get rid of the things which are inhibiting people to collaborate. So we focused on the organisation. We update the processes to look more at teams as well. We link in the digital technologies. We think about the design of the physical workspace as well, and whether that's enabling people to collaborate in teams effectively. And then we use technologies to be able to do all of that, and we link the things that we're doing to measure our success to those things as well. So there's this growing focus on organisation network analysis, for example, which I think is great. But again, we should always be strategically trying to link the measures we use to the plans and objectives we have. If the outcomes we're trying to create in our organisation are around social capital, organisation network analysis makes huge sense. If our outcomes are still about human capital, then an engagement survey probably fits the bill more effectively. So it's just about having that train of logic, just real clarity what we're trying to achieve, and then rethinking everything that we're doing to ensure that it is truly growing the outcomes that we need.
Well, that's a great theory. So what you're saying is that you have to start with the organizational design first, and then align your HR processes and have technology in it, and then have a way to measure all of this so that you can create a solid, strategic organization that has everything in place, right? And
that's a wonderful summary. Thank you.
All right, good. I got that right. But yeah, the way you say it, it has to be very strategic, and it has to have measures around it so that you understand what is good for the organization and what's not, and create a social organization that's not just surviving, but it's thriving, it's being productive, because that's really, the end goal here, right? So I understand that it's a process, but what are the main challenges that usually organizations fail at, or they just do not take into consideration while creating a social organization?
Well, one that I sort of referred to obliquely earlier is, again, it's about that sort of value chain based thinking. It's being focused on their own organization. So one of the things we do far too often is rely on best practices, is copy what other organisations are doing, and I that takes us away from a strategic approach. So the most common thing I think is that it's a little bit like I was explaining with organisation network analysis. That's becoming a more common thing that people in the analytics space are talking about more, and therefore HR people are coming across it and thinking, well, that everyone's saying ONA is the next big thing. We're going to implement that, and that may be useful, but we should just be trying more and more to work through. These are the outcomes, these are the activities, this is the way we measure them, these are the technologies and thinking about what makes best fit for our own organisation. So things like benchmarks can be useful because they highlight potential issues or potential opportunities in the organisation. But we should only ever see them as that. The key focus of our thinking should always be, what do we need to do in our organisation based upon the unique business that we are. So in fact, the first thing I try to do with any organisation is to be really clear about what objectives that we're trying to create. And those are, so there are three objectives that I always try to single out. So the first is the outcomes that we're trying to create linked to the business objectives that the business is focused on. So that's the mix of human, social, organisation capital. What are the qualities that we're trying to create in our people that will both support and enable the business to be successful? The second thing is a set of principles about how we see our organisation working, embedding our beliefs about people management. How do we think people management works. What are our views and perspectives and ideology about being a people leader? How do people end up being motivated, and those sort of questions, and try to express that through the way that we want our organisation to work. So that the outcomes are what do we want our organisation to achieve, and the principles are how do we see it working and achieving those outcomes. And we need both of those two things. Again, if we don't have that clarity, then we're bound to end up following a best practice approach, because we don't have anything to create best fit around. And then the third thing, which I think is a newer aspect of that, is what are the needs and expectations of our workforce. And this, to me, is how we really start to put a motor behind the employee experience. And I know there are lots of different ways of generating that. And I think approaches like developing personas and journey mapping and all of those sort of things are quite useful, but they're also a little bit reactive. Because I think the trap we fall into sometimes is that we take some sort of old, traditional, clunky ways of doing HR, and we do some journey mapping, and we try to make those clunky processes look a little bit less horrid, but they're still fundamentally pretty unsound. Whereas what we really need to do is go back to the original design of our organisation and of the processes and everything else that are part of that organisation, and redesign them for the business and also for employees. So if we have those three initial objectives, the what and the how, the outcomes and the principles in terms of what we want our organisation to achieve, but also the employee expectations, and we design our organisation to achieve that, not just to work for the business, but to work for employees at the same time, then I think we develop a much more effective organisation. So that's the other way that I'd suggest we get round that really common failing in organisations of just sort of latching on to the next big thing. We really need to, if we want to be strategic, if we simply want to be operational, none of this matters that much. Let's just do the best practices and improve the best practices. Fine. But if we want a strategic focus in our organisations, we've really got to get to grips with the opportunities to align what we do with HR with those objectives that are going to make the most powerful differences to our businesses.
Absolutely. I think, that you cannot take shortcuts in creating, a social organization. You have to be strategic, and you have to lay down the design of it. And also, what I do also understand is that this would be very dynamic, right? I mean, now suddenly we've got the pandemic, and a lot of businesses are going to rethink their strategy. They will have to go through a radical shift. So, would they have to change their organizational design now? And, how can they think forward from here?
Right, okay. So firstly, can I just pick up on the shortcuts point? Because I think that's true. We always need to know what we're doing, or any short-term specific operational action could be suboptimal. Having said that, not everything needs to be a grand strategic program. There are always things that we can do now to take us forward. And in fact, what I quite often consider to be a really effective way of doing strategic HR is trying to combine, and actually a lot of this comes from Linda Grattan's book, The Living Strategy, that I mentioned right at the beginning, where she talked about sort of two levels of strategy, a strategic longer term focus and a shorter term focus as well. And I do think we need both of those too. So I think we need that long term vision of what we're trying to create. And a lot of those outcomes, as I've been referring to, do take a period of time to create. The most important capabilities in our people aren't going to change in a week or a month. They can take 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Again, I don't like the word culture, but if you want to change the culture of the organisation, you've got to be in it for the longer term. But increasingly, the world is more agile and focused on, what can we do now? And I think we do need that short-term focus as well. So what I think works really well in the HR space in particular is having the long-term vision, but then sort of thinking about the current state and what is the best thing we can do now to work towards that. So if you don't have the long-term vision, then I think shortcuts can be quite difficult. If you have the long-term vision, it doesn't all need to be about that 5-year plan to get there. It can simply be, what's going on in the organisation? What are the issues at the current point? And what are the best things that we can do now to move forward, to make a big difference to where we are today, that are all also going to take us in the direction that we need to go? So things like responding to coronavirus, there's a lot of actions that we need to be taking now, simply responding to that crisis and changing the way that people work and ensuring that people are keeping safe and helping them, have a sort of some clarity about what they need to do and feeling as engaged as is possible given the worrying times that we're working in, all of those sort of things. But if we've got that clarity about where we're heading as well, there will always be opportunities to do those short-term transactional activities in a way that is building long-term capability as well. And one of my sort of key thoughts about where we are at the moment, just from the conversations that I've been having with HR people, is, as I was saying before, the digital workplace has now become the organisation for many people. Suddenly, I was talking to a client a couple of days ago who has been trying to get people using Microsoft Office 365, Teams and so on for a couple of years without very much success, and their adoption of that particularly Teams has gone up sort of 400% over the past 2 weeks. And they're in a fortunate position in a way that everybody at least has access to the technology, but now they're trying to bring in the cultural and sort of managerial changes behind that as well. So it's been a massive change in the way that people work. But what we're noticing is that people are still using those tools to communicate in a fairly centralized way. So most of the electronic digital communication is still taking place through the functional reporting lines, even while the technologies themselves actually give people the capacity now to work in a much more distributed way. So what I'm encouraging that and other clients to do is to use this new opportunity to move towards some of those different ways of organising people that I was talking about previously. So, how do we now bring in more of a focus, particularly on communities and networks, because actually we can do that more effectively using the technologies than perhaps we've been able to do before. So we can do some of the short-term things to help people use the technology effectively, and we can do that with a view towards long-term benefits as well. I think that's one of the key benefits that a more strategic approach also provides.
Right, so it's really about, you can have a long-term vision and then take short steps towards it and have technology as an enabler, especially, in these times, and, take leverage of communities and networks, to really kind of help organizations move ahead at this point in time.
Perfect. Thank you.
Right. So, when you create people-centric design for organizations, right, there are a lot of things that you need to take care of. Like, let's say there's the gig workforce now, and you need to include contract workers in terms of, people, the different kinds of people, how you categorize them, right? So, there are different kinds of productivity levels, and there would be different kinds of alignments towards their goals, and you could have OKRs and KPIs for all of that. But do you think that they are really effective? And what is kind of the central measure to understand the impact of your design, of your organizational design?
Well, KPIs will be effective if they're linked to what you're trying to change. So it's a little bit like I was talking about the use of organisation network analysis earlier. I think one of the mistakes we make is that we keep sort of our strategic objectives, the plans, the measures, benchmarks, analytics, all in sort of separate pots, separate categories. Whereas really that should be more of a funnel through those different things. So what we should be trying to do is to, again, identify the objectives in the way that I've been describing, identify measures against those objectives, and whether that's OKRs or SMART objectives, I'm not too fussed, but we need clear measures linked to those objectives. And then we can analyse those strategic measures, and if we follow that flow, then it means the analytics we do will be much more powerful because they're linked to things that we've already defined as being important. So in terms of sort of the changes in the workforce, which I completely agree are important, and the contractor and contingent aspect of workforces are having a bigger and bigger remit in different organisations. We just need to be clear how we're trying to use people differently. And again, going back to that point about the employee expectations, how do those expectations change across those different groups? And the more clarity we can have around that, the easier it starts to be to measure something. So again, measurement should never be difficult. Whenever we find that we're struggling to measure something, that's a signal that we're not clear enough about what we're trying to achieve. If we have clarity about what we're trying to do, there should always be an evident measure to capture how well we're doing that. But the key is the key is the objective first. So again, I quite often find organisations have we're doing an engagement survey. So as the plan changes and we have a new objective, I think HR very often gets in a position where we're asking ourselves, how can we measure that thing? We can add a question to the engagement survey. And that might be sort of the right answer. But very often, actually, if this is the key thing that we need, if we're really focused on diversity or collaboration or whatever it is, rather than retrofitting the engagement survey, let's have a survey about diversity or collaboration. Let's design the measurement mechanism, the tool, to give us the data to monitor the particular objective, whether that's about contingent working or whatever it is. It starts with clarity, and then measurement becomes a lot simpler.
And this clarity that you talk about, who is it that's supposed to give clarity to the organization? Is it just the HR, or is it the leaders, or is it people having a hierarchical organization and then people talking to their teams about this clarity? What is it?
Yes, it's all of those. Leaders have a key role in all organisations, but increasingly so do employees. That's why the employee experience is coming to the fore. And again, I think the coronavirus pandemic, with people working remotely and virtually in a way that we can't control them, as managers have often attempted to do in the past, that's raising employee empowerment to yet another level than we've seen in the past. So managers and leaders need to be involved, employees need to be involved, at the appropriate levels to be working through what they need to do and what the appropriate outcomes at those appropriate levels would be. But I do think that HR can take a special role within this. And in fact, one of the things I was suggesting earlier is that focusing on the outcomes, human social capital that we're trying to create, has a number of significant advantages to help us be more strategic. And one of those is that one of the opportunities I think that HR has to develop a more strategic role is to take accountability at the organisational level for the outcomes that we're achieving. So whatever those outcomes are, whether they are engagement or diversity or the propensity to collaborate in the workforce or whatever it may be, if I was still an HR director, I would firstly want to articulate what those outcomes are, but at the centre of my strategy and the activities and processes that I'm undertaking to create them. And then I would say, and across the whole organisation, I am going to take accountability for those things being achieved. Now, again, they're long-term objectives and therefore long-term accountabilities. And it is a strange form of accountability because it's accountability without responsibility. You know, where we can't be responsible for people, it's the managers and the individuals themselves that need to have the responsibility. But we can take the accountability. We can say we will be accountable for growing engagement by 10% over the next 2 years, and in a sense sort of put our job on the line to be to do that. Now that increases the risk in our own role, but it should also increase the reward. You know, if the difference between somebody who's just sort of going through undertaking the best practices and somebody who's got that focus on creating the right outcomes and is taking accountability for those is vast. It's a really, really powerful way of developing HR's credibility and contribution with inside an organisation. So HR has a special role. And we need to be developing leaders to really understand that their role is about leading people, and that is their day job. You know, any sort of technical aspects of their role is what they do after that they've engaged and coached their people, rather than simply the thing that they focus on. And more and more, you know, we are going to be moving towards an environment of self-management, self-organisation. So it's about balancing all of that. And HR has a particular role at the organisation of understanding what we should be doing to create the right outcomes that will lead to the business impacts. But our managers, our leaders need to do that, and the employees themselves. You know, one of the big shifts in the way that we organise people now needs to be that we're getting clutter, we're getting bureaucracy out of the way, so that employees can see for themselves what are the things that they should be doing and how they should be investing in themselves to create their own outcomes that can help them be strategically successful at the local level as well. So things like I mentioned in terms of the organisation, using more use of communities, you know, rather than simply managing people hierarchically, bringing people together into communities to enable them to focus on things that they're passionate about. That's one way we can give more empowerment to people. Or at the individual level, we can let them set their own objectives. We can bring in approaches like job crafting or job sculpting, where the individual has a role in shaping their own jobs and what they're doing on a daily basis. And all of those approaches enable people to play a more strategic role in our organisations as well. And as HR practitioners, firstly, we should have that strategic view for the organisation, but we do also need to be enabling people to do more of this for themselves.
Absolutely, it's a collective effort, and then if you can give power to one individual and help them grow and find out what is it that they're passionate about, and get communities together on the same level, I think that would really kind of help organizations flourish and grow. Well, thank you so much for that explanation. That helps a lot. And lastly, would you give any important advice to leaders, or any important sound bites that you would like to leave for our audience as well?
Well, I'm not wonderful at sound bites, and I think it goes with the territory. Strategic HR is, as you've been saying, it's about sort of complex ideas, and therefore, sort of a more of discursive sort of review of a particular item is we latch on to sound bites too quickly. I put that in the same category as best practices. I try to avoid them. I want to understand things, not just have a quick summary that will be retweeted on Twitter. But my summary, or perhaps the one thing that we've not talked about, this strategic approach that I've been talking about is centered on the people working inside an organization. There's a lot of conversation, there's a lot of focus in HR, a lot of appropriate focus on understanding the business, on getting close to the business, on talking the language of business, all of those sort of things. And it's so important. It's one of the reasons why I'm really pleased that I did start my career outside of HR, in engineering, in IT, because it's given me a broader understanding of businesses. When I was an HR director, when I was head of HR for audit in the UK, the first thing I did was go out on audit teams to understand what people were doing in practice. It's absolutely vital. But the strategic difference, the thing that HR provides, the ability to make those accountabilities take place, doesn't come from HR's understanding the business. It comes from HR's understanding of people and the way that we work together. So the thing that I think receives enough attention in HR always is understanding people. And you said yourself, HR is really complicated. We need to understand the business, we need to understand technology, analytics is having a bigger role, all of these things that we need to understand. But the key one is understanding people. So, if we want to develop human capital, we need to be experts in psychology. We need to understand what it is that we can do that create environments that will lend people to be more engaged, to be more motivated. If we're focused on social capital, we really need to get to grips with key ideas from sociology, from anthropology, to help us understand how people work together more effectively. We need to be really interested in all of the new insights from cognitive neuroscience, from behavioral economics, all of the people sciences, so that we can have confidence in the insights and the interventions that we want to put in place, that if we do these activities, it's really going to create those outcomes that we have in mind. So that would probably be the sort of final thing that I'd want to add. Thank you.
Absolutely, that's wonderful. It's really about the people, and if you can really understand the person's mentality and how they work, and if you can create accountability, which is a very important point that you also pointed out, accountability and having a sense of ownership in an individual, I think that would really create a lot of impact and give a lot of impetus to the organization as well. So thank you for that. That was wonderful, and I had a pleasure talking to you, Jon. I really appreciate your time and sharing your views with us. It's really been a learning experience. I learned a lot of new things. So thank you so much for that.
My pleasure. Thank you for some really good questions and some wonderful summaries as well. And I enjoyed the conversation, and hope the listeners and viewers will appreciate it and will help them act more strategically to do.
Definitely. And I think we should do more of these and have more conversations in these. It would be really enriching for our audience as well.
Perfect. I'd love to. Thank you.
Thank you.